Welcome to the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums virtual program, Redefining Narrative, a series of conversations with scholars and leaders in the cultural sector. I'm Deborah Schwartz, and I serve on the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums Board of Directors, and I am delighted to be your host. Redefining Narrative invites viewers to explore new approaches to working within the cultural sector, presenting fresh ideas about the pressing issues of our time, and in many cases, disrupting age-old formulas for what we expect to find within the confines of museums. Each episode is approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and we hope each of our 5-part series will encourage conversation and debate for people working in museums, as well as students and the general public who are curious about why and how museums make choices about their exhibitions and programs. On behalf of the staff and board of the Mid-Atlantic Association, and with thanks, I want to acknowledge that this program was funded in part by Humanities New York with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. In today's episode of Redefining Narrative, we will ask hard questions about why Americans display a remarkable lack of historical knowledge and seem instead to have replaced an understanding of history with a passion for nostalgia. All too often, museums have been complicit in this phenomenon. This indifference to history is inextricably tied to the history of American racism and anti-immigrant policies, and much more. Our guest today has devoted much of her career to analyzing, writing, and teaching about these distortions. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Dr. Gretchen Soren. Gretchen is Director and Distinguished Service Professor at the Cooperstown Graduate Program, a training program for museum curators, educators, and directors that is part of the State University of New York College at Oneonta. She is also a fellow of the New York Academy of Historians. Gretchen has more than 30 years of experience in the museum profession. She has served as a guest curator for many exhibitions, including Bridges and Boundaries, African Americans and American Jews for the Jewish Museum in New York, and the award-winning Wilderness Cure, Tuberculosis and the Adirondacks for the Adirondack Museum. Excuse me. I should pause to say that Bridges and Boundaries was one of the most important exhibitions in my awakening as a museum professional, and it's a standout, even though it's from a very long time ago. Dr. Soren is the recipient of many awards, including the Catherine Coffey Award from the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums and the Thurgood Marshall Unity Award from the Oneonta NAACP and the State University of New York Chancellor's Research Award. In 2006, she was named to the rank of Distinguished Service Professor. Dr. Soren writes and lectures frequently on museum practice, diversity and inclusion, and African American history. Her most recent book is Driving While Black, African American Travel and the Road to Civil Rights. Gretchen is also co-writer and senior historian with Steeplechase Films and filmmaker Rick Burns on the documentary film Driving While Black, Race, Space, and Mobility that aired nationwide on PBS in 2020 and 2021. I am so honored to be here with you, Gretchen. Welcome, and I will turn the stage over to you, and then I will return for a brief conversation between the two of us.
Thanks, Deborah. Thank you. I'll just start by sharing my screen. I think I have more questions perhaps than answers, but I'd like to raise some of those questions with you this afternoon. So In 2018, the American Historical Association, in collaboration with Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey, did a survey asking Americans what they thought about American history. And I think it was pretty revealing what they found. And one of the most important things was that most Americans just think history is about facts. It's about events, dates, and facts. It's not really about inquiry, which is what historians think it's about. And so that divide really gives us some insight into why Americans feel as they do about history. One of the things that was very clear from the survey was that a large number of people think that not enough time is spent on women's history in high schools and colleges in the study of history, but also a large number of people felt that too much time was spent on women's history. And these divides were really based on politics. Of course, Republicans had different ideas than Democrats, but there were also divides based on age. Young people felt differently than older people. And geography. People from certain parts of the country felt differently than people from other parts of the country. So we're really very separate when it comes to thinking about what history is and how history should be studied. And of course, very divisive was the issue of LGBTQ history, whether or not too much time is spent on it or not enough time is spent on it in schools. As I was thinking about African-American history and my own experiences, so much of what I have studied shows that people are totally unaware of things like the Great Migration, which is really the largest number of people migrating within our country. 6 million African-Americans leaving the rural South to go to the urban North, and very little of this makes its way, I think, into high school textbooks. And the same is true of the violence that affected African Americans. This is a picture of Black Wall Street in Tulsa after it was looted and burned and people were basically assassinated. We don't want to think of our country as a violent country, although when we talk about the revolution, we celebrate the revolution, and the revolution is really about violence. It's about war, but we don't think of it as being about violence and about war. And we want to celebrate. There's a real divide. Many people think that we should be celebrating American history, and to tell more complete stories is to denigrate. Of course, one of the most divisive issues, according to some Americans, is the issue of slavery. And not so much whether it existed, but the cruelty of slavery is something that we choose to ignore. The violence of slavery is something we choose to ignore. And particularly, even yesterday I was doing a program for the state of New Jersey, and so many people are even unaware that slavery existed in the North. This, by the way, is a painting by James Ates in Albany, New York, with the African American over on the far right side. So I think when we're talking about American history, we have a really long way to go to convince people that it's important to tell broader stories and to really start to think about history as a way of understanding American democracy and fostering democracy. It seems to me that the groups, the Jewish Americans, women, LGBT groups, African Americans, those groups that have really pushed the boundaries are the groups that have really helped us to keep the democracy strong. And that's really the approach that I take in talking about the violence and some of the issues that are considered difficult. And I say difficult with tongue in cheek, because I don't think this is difficult history. I don't think African-American history is difficult history, and I don't think it's a good idea for us to consider the history of some of these more contentious issues difficult, but simply a part of the story that we really need to be focusing on in order to get to a greater understanding of what it means to live in a democracy. So Deborah, do you want to continue a little more with the conversation?
I am happy to do that. Thank you very much for framing this. I think perhaps one place to start our conversation, there's obviously so much that you've just laid out that is, incredibly important to the choices and decisions that museums are making, even as we sit here talking about in terms of exhibitions and programs and their commitments to American history and how we unpack it. So for me, perhaps one of the ways to think about that to start with is perhaps with some examples of museums that you feel have done a particularly good job of looking at our history and animating it for the public in ways that are both provocative and helpful and engage people in ways that they need to be engaged.
I guess I think one of the places that we have to start is in Monticello. And they have done, I think, an outstanding job of doing the work, doing the research that complicates Thomas Jefferson. I think one of the most important things we can do is to humanize these historical figures like Thomas Jefferson, like George Washington. It's not to demonize them, but to humanize them. And in so doing, I think it says to us, we can do great things too. We can accomplish things too. We can further democracy. It's not putting them on a pedestal and saying, we can't touch, their accomplishments. I think recently, one of my graduate students actually had a really unpleasant experience. She's doing her summer internship at Monticello, and she was accosted by visitors who said that she was tarnishing Thomas Jefferson's reputation. And I think that's absolutely wrong. I think that she was rounding him out. She was fleshing him out. She was showing the complicated person that he was, but also exactly what life was like in the 18th century. And there was so much hard labor to do in the 18th century. I'm not excusing slavery, but I'm understanding how people with means, people with money, used that money to live a particular lifestyle. And that lifestyle required that people chop wood for them and carry water for them and cook for them and clean for them. It was a very difficult and hard life. I don't excuse it. I don't think it was moral, but I do think it was the choice that people of wealth made in order to live a particular lifestyle.
Gretchen, why do you think it is so hard for people to accept the nuance of,
interesting, isn't it?
People are not perfect. People are, pushed and pulled and motivated by a whole host of complicated factors around them. And it doesn't all come out neat and tidy. And it certainly doesn't all come out that people are all good or all bad.
Exactly.
And yet we have a terrible time. We have a terrible time with that with our politicians currently. We have a terrible time with that, certainly with historical figures. Why do you think that is?
It's, first of all, I don't think we do a very good job in high schools teaching history. I don't think that people in high school are exposed to, we've gotten rid of civics, and we're not teaching history in a way that's dynamic and interesting. But obviously, as historians, we haven't done a good enough job in talking about that nuance, in talking about how people are complicated, and in talking about how various groups have helped to push the democracy forward. Americans say they like history, but we don't really like to look at it very critically. We don't really like to look at the unpleasant parts of our history. And we want to celebrate it, and we see the unpleasant parts somehow as unpatriotic, which is ridiculous because the history of the world is about human failings.
And it's messy.
And it's very messy. It's very messy. One of the bright lights is that people have said they view museums as the most trustworthy, as one of the most trustworthy purveyors of history. So I think we're the ones, it's not textbooks, it's certainly not college professors, it's not historians, but it's museums that have a special role to play in conveying accurate history. And I think we've got to continue to push that, but also push the idea that history is messy and that democracies are particularly messy, and that those groups that are constantly holding the mirror up to the democracy and saying, we have to do better, are the ones that are helping to maintain the democracy. If we just talk about how great we are all the time, that's not going to help us when the democracy is falling apart.
So the other thing for me that's connected to this is this sort of false notion that history is a set. You started out by talking about, people think it's a set of facts. The extension of that for me is people think of it as history is set and it doesn't need to be revisited, where it's very clear that certainly from many of the exhibitions I can think of in museums, that part of the work that's being done is the opportunities we have to rethink history, to bring in new information and new ideas and new perspectives on ideas that were kind of laid out for us 25 years ago or 50 years ago, that desperately need the information we now can take from, whether it's, a newfound set of letters or, a document from a general in a war,
or from Sally Hemings' descendants.
Right. So
new information is key. And we don't, for some reason, Americans see history as set. We seem to see science as set as well, that it's unchanging, and that there's constantly new information that's bringing us new insight into history. And we have to do a better job of making those primary documents somehow available to the public, making the public aware. It seems that popular film is more popular than, and television is more popular than books in the surveys, which I think is pretty interesting, which means that the documentaries, people are watching documentaries, they're watching even fictitious television shows to get their historical information.
So that, could turn into an opportunity, but it may also be a challenge for museums. Are there examples you can think of where museums have been partnering on the making of some of those films, or I'm thinking, about even show, what it means for a museum to show a film series, that allows people to see many perspectives and also see sort of distortions of history, and to be able to talk about those distortions.
I think so. The documentarians, the well-known ones, like Rick Burns, do a great deal of research, and that is important. Research is always important, and many of those documentaries are so incredibly well done, and I think great sources of information. There are lots of curators that are participants in those. Usually recognize a few people. I'm thinking that those provide great sources of information. I'm wondering whether or not politicians are out of step with a lot of their constituents when it comes to understanding and knowing history, because so many people do feel that we could use more information about women's history, about LGBTQ history, about African-American history, but our politicians are making laws now forbidding what they call divisive history, which I'm not sure I know what that actually means. What's divisive? But I think museums have to continue to push. I know some museums are afraid. They're
Are they
afraid.
afraid because of funding? Are they afraid?
They're afraid because of funding. They're afraid because their interpreters are being confronted by individuals who don't like the story that's being told, or they feel that too much emphasis is being put on a particular story, and so they pull back. But I think as the primary purveyors of these stories to the general public, it's really important for museums to push forward and not to pull back. I will, yesterday I was working on a project with the Dyckman Farmhouse, and they are starting, I shouldn't say starting, they have instituted a project called Dyckman Discovered, which uncovers the lives of the enslaved people who lived and worked on the farm. And if you can imagine, the Dyckman farm was more than 250 acres of what's now Manhattan. It was river to river. The land that the Dyckmans owned was river to river. How could the Dyckman family have possibly managed that farm by themselves? It's historically inaccurate to try and tell that story without telling the story of the enslaved people who worked that farm. It just doesn't make sense historically. And it really brings kind of vibrancy and kind of fascinating way of thinking about what New York must have been like, or New Amsterdam must have been like in the 17th and 18th centuries, because you had so many people living cheek by jowl that were different. You had the Dutch, you had the Africans, you had the English, you had Jewish families. New Amsterdam was a very different colony. It wasn't a religious colony. It was founded solely for business. And there was religious tolerance in New York. And so you had all of these people living side by side. Some of them were enslaved, some of them were indentured servants, and some of them were business people. But it must have been a fascinating community, and to really understand how dynamic and interesting and how many languages were spoken in New York in the 18th century. Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. Was Ladino was spoken. There were African dialects, there was Dutch, so many different Spanish, so many different languages, such a vibrant community.
Will this take the form of an exhibition at some point, or is it too early to know how it will
take the
play
form
out?
of a reinterpretation of the house and the grounds? And of course, they wanted to make sure that they talk about the fact that on the land before the Dutch came, there were native people. There were Lenape people who lived on the land, and so they've got to discuss the Lenape people as well as the Dutch and the Africans, and of course the English later take over. So very diverse community, as just as New York is now, it was a very diverse community in the 18th century. the community there, which is now primarily Colombian, has embraced this new interpretation. They found it fascinating. And the museum has really become a resource for the people in the community, a resource that has, they've taken on food programs. They have a program called Growing Uptown, which addresses the food issues in the community. They have a program related to Dutch history, this kind of standard American history. They have a contemporary art program where they bring in local artists to do all kinds of programs, including last year, one artist projected words on the outside of the building at night. So, the museum is not just about a little Dutch farmhouse anymore. It's looking at contemporary uses, I would say contemporary uses of history, and contemporary needs in the community and addressing them. And I think more museums have to do that, especially as their neighborhoods are changing, and as they think about what matters to people who live near the museum.
Well, I also think that part of what you're underscoring is that, some of the questions we have about history and, sort of recapturing what it really was with all its complexity is also what we need to do for our own moment in time. And many of the issues around, systemic racism that are with us today have some of their roots in these stories. And it makes so much sense to me what you're describing, that the Dyckman farmhouse is connecting the dots between their history that they are now recapturing and things that people might care about today, in Upper Manhattan, in New York City in general. We have a very complicated history, that contemporary sort of landscape that we're grappling with all the time. And it certainly works well to bring those two things together.
And they haven't been afraid as well to adopt they've created a lecture series called Talking About Race Matters. And they haven't been afraid to talk about race. And I think what's been most fascinating is that the speakers for the Talking About Race Matters conversations have been from a wide variety of backgrounds. Museum people, historians, sociologists, but also people in the area of dance and people in the area of music. And now they're just starting a series that addresses food and food insecurity. And so issues that really transcend history and come right up to the present, but also, as you're saying, that are rooted in the past. And how do we make those connections for people and for the community? And how do we engage the community in those conversations, not just talking at them, but getting them to engage with us? I think we're a divided country. No, yeah. And I think how do we start to bridge that divide? What can museums do to start bridging that divide?
So in a couple of other of these conversations that we're doing in this series, we've actually seen how important oral history is to kind of the entire field of museums. And we've had two of our other guests actually talking very eloquently about how important that work is in connecting communities to the work of museums. So Zahir Ali talking about his work on Muslims in Brooklyn, and then Kevin Smith talking about capturing and revisiting some long lost information in the form of recordings in the indigenous cultures that he's dealing with in upper New York State. So really interesting. There's a kind of leitmotif about how we connect community to the active work we do, whether it's as historians or in other kinds of cultural settings, and in our museums.
And I think that's so important when museums don't have collections related to many of these groups. Oral histories provide collections. They provide some of that context and some of that missing element that we need. Much of my own work involves gathering oral histories as well. And one of the things that I love to do is to gather oral histories. So I think it's important work. It's very expensive, and we haven't quite figured out how to store everything and care for everything adequately, but it's really important work to do.
Can you give me an example from the work you did on Driving While Black, and about an oral history that really changed something about how you approached the history?
I gathered, well, one of the first oral histories that I gathered was from a woman named Vernell Allen, who was a hairdresser who had moved from Louisiana to New York City in the 1940s, I believe, maybe even before, maybe the 1930s, in order to study hairdressing. And she went to Albany, New York, and she set up a beauty shop after she had studied in Harlem. And she was using that, the stories she told me were really hilarious. She started to do the hair of these women that came from Saratoga. Every week they would get their hair done 2 or 3 times a week. And I thought, 2 or 3 times a week, what is that about? And it turned out that they were prostitutes and in Saratoga, and they were working with a madam, and they would come down to Albany a couple times a week. And Saratoga is the home of the Racing Hall of Fame and horse racing. And in the summertime, there was a brothel in Saratoga, and these women would come down to Albany and get their hair done a couple times a week, and then go back to Saratoga. So I was absolutely astonished. I think it's a story that is completely unknown and completely fascinating, and it really speaks to kind of a different way of thinking about Saratoga Springs.
Indeed.
Kind of changed my way of thinking about Saratoga, but also she was familiar with a family named Green. My hairdresser was familiar with a family named Green. And as we were talking, she said, well, maybe they're the family of the Green Book. And I thought, nah, couldn't possibly be the family of the Green Book. And she called them up, and it turns out they were.
Wow. And
so that was the way I found the Greens of the Negro Motorist Green Book, which is really the Negro Motorist Green Book is the booklet that's become so incredibly popular across the country. It's become, kind of the Bible for the National Park Service and, the National Trust, and all of these organizations are using it as kind of their Bible for discovering African-American historic sites. But that was how I actually came across doing an oral history, was how I came across the family.
That is amazing. That is a great story. The other thing I think about oral history and your story sort of personifies it, is it's not just about sort of collecting these oral histories. It's about listening to them very carefully and, thinking about what it is that somebody is conveying to you about their life, whether it's emotional or more journalistic, or about the dynamics of family or the dynamics of, education or anything else that somebody might be telling us in those stories. And, as a historian, I'm assuming that for you, that kind of, listening carefully for the nuggets of information that you hadn't ever heard before and that potentially lead you to some new set of information. But I think it is also the case that once somebody giving an oral history understands how valuable their story is, it's a kind of affirmation of a connection between a community and the institution that might be collecting those oral histories.
I think for a long time, African Americans didn't feel that their history was worth saving. People often ask me, well, can you tell me a little bit about Victor Green's business records? Well, there are no business records. I'm sure they were thrown away when the office was emptied. I'm sure no one thought at the time that they were important. But one of the things that happens when you're doing an oral history, and I always ask about photographs. Do you have any family photographs? Did you take photographs of your vacation? Did you take, is there an album that I could look at? And lo and behold, people will bring out their albums, their photographs. They've saved ephemera from church brochures or posters or other objects that are really valuable artifacts that represent African American history. And so they start to understand that their things are valuable, but also that these can be documented as well as the oral history, and they kind of support those stories.
Yeah, I think the National Museum of African American History and Culture, as it was building and building its collections, did an amazing job of reaching out to communities far and wide. And people were so excited about finally having an institution that they felt not just would value these things, but honor them with preservation and exhibition, and fold them into the storytelling that history museums do. And it was very moving to me to see how many people came forward with family materials. I have recently, in a very different area of study, been talking to folks at a small museum, which is known as the Yiddish Book Center in Massachusetts, where once they started to work on their project of gathering books in Yiddish that existed, and they thought they might come up with 1,000 books, and 20 years later, they have literally hundreds of thousands of books that they've gathered because people understood that this is a very important part of a legacy that now has a place, a home, and a place that will utilize their books.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And they were saved in families.
Saved in family attics, boxes of books that somehow, the few books that were squirreled away by somebody who made it out of Germany or Poland, books that survived the Holocaust, books that, all kinds of amazing, the books were clearly valued enough so that by hook or by crook, they found their way out of Europe.
That's
so
great.
yeah. But I think that, it's really interesting. It speaks to one of the parts of museum work that I'm not sure the general public thinks of that often, which is the research arm of museums. So, if museums are gathering these artifacts, which contain within them so much knowledge, and so much information, that is, not just literally the text of a book, but the artifacts, that people keep, that, those things provide us with these opportunities to revisit our history.
I think this whole idea recently that we've seen of curating wines and curating clothing collections and curating, cheeses or whatever, really does a disservice to curators, because you don't just pick stuff. I mean, when you curate a box of wine, you choose a box of wine. The history process is very different. The curatorial process for a museum or an exhibition is very different, because that research piece is deep and very long and time consuming. And it's not just about having good taste and picking something pretty. It's about really inquiry into a topic and understanding that topic in a very deep way, and then being able to find those things that tell you about that topic, that kind of elucidate that topic for you. Very different. And I think the word curate has been misused or overused.
I think that's a great point. I also think it's an opportunity for us, as we close up this conversation, to think about the ways in which the practice of curating, in some respects, has evolved, and that curators very often at this point, if they don't have an artifact to represent an important idea, will find another way to represent the idea rather than simply leave it out of a story. And that's a kind of evolution of thinking that I think has probably been very, very important in museums, particularly maybe history museums. Is, if we don't have an artifact, but we know something happened or there's a story to tell, we find another way to tell those stories.
And I think a museum that does that incredibly well is the History Center in Montreal. That is, they love to tell stories about organizations and groups that no longer exist. And they told the story of Lost Montreal, of 4 communities in Montreal that no longer exist. And they used a wide variety of methods, exhibition techniques, both low, kind of low tech and high tech, to tell the story of commercial sex workers, of people who lived on the street, of police and interactions with police, a wide variety of topics that really, kind of this kind of these lost stories, to bring them to light. And I think that they have a really good track record of figuring out ways of doing that without any objects at all.
That's great. I love gathering those pieces of information about the museums who are, that have really figured out creative solutions to our work. And so if you think of others, let us know, and we'll include it in some of the material that we're putting together for this series.
Oh, great idea.
I want to, before we say our closing words, Gretchen, I just want to pause and thank our ASL interpreters, Kenya and Kaylee. Thank you so much. Your work with us is so valuable, and we really appreciate your joining us for this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Gretchen, I'm going to give you the last word here for perhaps putting your finger on an issue that you think museums really need to work on that they aren't doing a good enough job with.
Ooh, that's you left me with a tough question. I think we're not doing a very good job yet of diversifying our staffs and boards. And I know we didn't dive into that at all during our conversation, but I know museums want to try and do better with that. I know that communities feel more comfortable with that when they see people that look like them working in the museum and not just as guards. I think we've done a great job of bringing in support staff of color, but we haven't done as good a job bringing in curators and people in professional positions. And I think we need to do better. And I think we particularly need to do better in boards. Our boards boards of museums are still tied very much to big money and not necessarily to kind of the other important services that people perhaps can contribute on their boards. So I would say that's the area that we need to work on next.
I think that is the perfect final comment. Thank you, Gretchen, so much. You are just an extraordinary beacon in this field for your work, which you have never let up, sort of your commitment to looking at history in new ways, in important ways, and in training generations of museum professionals with a set of values that have everything to do with a more equitable world. And we are forever grateful to you for that.
Thanks, Deborah.